Welcome everyone who's joined us today. We're inviting the rest of our guests in at the moment, so please bear with us for a couple of minutes. You're here to view a panel that is timed with World Refugee Day, which is marked every June 20th, and also the launch of our multimedia project at openDemocracy called Parallel Journeys Global Migration Trails. You'll find the link in the chat box. We just published it a couple of hours ago. And just to give you a sense of where our panelists are joining from, I am joining from Beirut. We have Claudio Formisano joining from Rome, Leah Yamin from Lebanon, and Nassim Majidi from Afghanistan. And of course, we have our special guests here, Gru and Hamid, who are featured in the video series that we've launched, and they're joining from Stord, Norway. I'll go more into the introductions for the first questions. All right, it looks like we are good to start. Well, it gives me immense pleasure to be hosting this panel today. Let me preface by talking about a little bit about Parallel Journeys, the multimedia platform that I just mentioned. The idea first emerged when I was founding editor at News Deeply's platform on forced migration called Refugees Deeply. At that time, returns of Afghan asylum seekers from Europe and the evictions of Syrian refugees in Lebanon had started to rise. Similar trends emerged with Kenya's camps being emptied of Somali refugees, while in the Americas, consecutive US administrations were using Mexico as a buffer zone to send back asylum seekers from across the region. So I wanted to look at these migration trends along leading hotspots across the globe to go beyond the news cycles through immersive storytelling that combines film, expert analysis, and local reporting with the solutions journalism perspective. And so this first page, which we're going to showcase for you, focuses on deportations of Afghan asylum seekers, specifically from Norway. Yes, the page is up. And it is done through, it's presented through a video series that you will see as you scroll through the page. And the main narrative is led by Gru Dregelid, a Norwegian school teacher who's joining us today, who's helped hundreds navigate this asylum labyrinth of Europe. And she's actually become a mother to at least 30 of the boys. You will find stories about her various boys, some who got resettled in Norway and others who are reapplying in France, Spain, and other locations across Europe. Let's actually have a look at maybe one of the short videos. And I thought I'd pick one that takes the story all the way to the root of displacement in Afghanistan. Apologies, there might be a sound issue. we're going to try and replay that for you.
Amjad, kan du komma och hjälpa mig och så tolka med ringa till moder till mamma till Javed?
Ja, det kan jag hålla med.
När vi må ringa och fortälla till mamma till Javed att han har det bra i Spanien.
Mm.
Hai, Assalamualaikum Mama Javed.
وعليكم السلام. سنجاي خير جايد خدا.
Jag snakket med Javed igår och han har det väldigt bra i Spanien.
دير خدا ورده خدای دې جوړ لره الله دې کامیاب لره.
Skolan hver dag och ska göra sig i 1 år nu. Trots att Javed inte fick färdig i Norge.
رښتیا وي خفګان او تیر سو هغه بیچاره ډیر خفګان ډیر جړاګانې مونږ ته ولېږلې.
Javed är väldigt flink till att jobba hårt. Vi är väldigt stolta över honom.
خدای دې ورته کامیاب لره ورته.
As you can see, Gru is so attached to her boys that she even calls their mothers to keep them informed of their progress. So what we just saw was a phone call and exchange between her and one of the boys' mothers who's remained in Afghanistan along with the younger brother. And so the idea of this project is to start with these specific narratives that individualize and contextualize the experience of migration. And on that note, I'd like to invite Gru and Hamid, one of her boys, who are joining us from Sturd, to share a bit of what is going on with them these days since recording this video series. Hamid, summer has started, you finished high school. Could you tell us about your plans? Where is, first of all, your situation with your residency, and how does that affect your ability to go to university and your next steps?
So I finished high school a few weeks ago, so about 2 weeks ago.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. So I'll move to Bergen, which is about two hours to drive from here. So in fact, there is no limitation for me to study. So I can, for example, take loan from a bank, so study. whatever I want. So it depends if I have good grades or bad grades. If I have a good grades, I can study whatever I want. If I have bad grades, so my options are a little bit limited.
That's fantastic. And what are you planning on studying?
I'm going to study software engineering.
Okay, fantastic. And I hear that on the side, you're just studying Spanish these days because why not, right?
Yeah, so I have nothing to do. So that's why I'm going to focus on something else.
Fantastic. Gru, how are you these days? Are you just as busy as ever? You're closely tied to 30 boys in this period. They're all doing it differently based on their different situations, whether they've been given asylum in Norway or whether they're somewhere else, right?
Yeah, it's a big difference between the boys here in Norway and their chances and the boys other places in Europe or in Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan. So they are not given the same chance as Amit. Now he's studying Spanish only for fun. So, and he has very good grades, so he can do everything.
That's
so
fantastic.
It's a big difference. Those who have got the permission to stay in Norway, they are well taken care of in our system.
Absolutely. And then as the video series shows, you can, we've posted it on in the chat box, and apologies to those who have lighter Zoom connections or unstable connections. The video might have skipped, but the series is available to watch both on YouTube and also as part of the long read on openDemocracy's front page. And Gru is referring to the boys, the differences between the boys who've been resettled and those who are having to restart their asylum in different parts of Europe, because for none of them return to Afghanistan is really an option. But you can see that their progress is hugely impacted by whether they're allowed to recover early into their process or whether they are still struggling years after arriving in Europe to restart their lives. And I can't think of a better person to talk about this than Nassim Majidi, who's been documenting Afghan narratives along the migration trail within Europe. And she's actually worked on three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe on this topic. Nassim, could you, you're speaking from Afghanistan, which is going through quite a turbulent situation at the moment with US troop withdrawal and the increased violence. Could you talk a little bit about this, longitudinal study that you've conducted where you followed Afghans along the migration trail, and how has it informed your understanding of what their integration and reintegration needs are?
Thank you, Priti. Yes, I think at some point, it's one thing to be voicing the needs and the experiences of migrants, but there's really no one better than themselves to speak up for themselves. And so we decided to put in touch our Afghan researchers based in our Kabul office with Afghan migrants along the migration trail. So they had conversations, longitudinal conversations using oral history methods between Afghans in Kabul and Afghans in Iran, Turkey, Greece, all the way to Europe. And that really allowed us to connect and follow the whole of the migration process and really understand what the layered experiences of trauma can be, so that by the time we talk about return and reintegration, we're really talking about people who've suffered tremendously hard journeys. Sometimes the transit is 2 weeks, sometimes it's 2 years, with the horrors that on the migration route. But also the lack of comprehension for some of what happens to them when they get to Europe. They have no information on the asylum process, no understanding of why they get rejected or deported. And the other thing that I want to highlight is how increasingly children are being deported. And so that's, I think, one of the big shifts in my research in the last 10 years is I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years, especially, how normalized deportation of children have become, whether it's from the border from Iran and Pakistan, so regional, back to Afghanistan, or from Europe. We did the research in 2018 with Save the Children, documenting returns from Norway and Sweden to Afghanistan. We spoke to 57 children. 3/4 did not feel safe during the return process. They talked about violence and coercion in coming back. On arrival, they barely received any support or any reintegration plan, and most of them didn't attend school. They had been almost recruited by different groups to commit violent acts, and all they could aspire to was to remigrate. So really talking about reintegration in a context like Afghanistan, especially today, is more and more unconceivable. And the last thing I would like to mention is that return is just not a return home for many. We just released a study on returns from Sweden to Afghanistan and Iraq, and nearly half of the Afghan respondents were previously in Iran. So for many returnees, they come back to a country that they've never known. It's just their country of their citizenship, but it's definitely not a return home. So reintegration, again, is even harder.
Thank you for that, Nassim. And in keeping in line with that theme of returns without reintegration, Claudio, you've led a vital part of the UN Interagency Coordination Group against trafficking in persons. So let's talk a little bit about these different scenarios that you've seen emerge when asylum seekers are denied the opportunity to integrate in their host communities, and when they're forced to take even more difficult routes in pursuit of safety. What are the different situations that you've seen happening, perhaps drawing from your experience of working in the central Mediterranean region and also along the Balkan Trail?
Thank you, Preeti. Congratulations on your project that you have embarked on. It sounds fantastic. I'm looking forward to navigate through the material. It's really important, I think, to give a voice to these individuals and to tell their stories. So to answer your question, as you mentioned, I specialize in human trafficking and the smuggling of migrants. So a first tiny but necessary clarification I'd like to make is that these are distinct but intertwined crimes. These are terms that unfortunately are often conflated also by the media and the press, and that could generate confusion to people in terms of what we're trying to respond to. So in very simplistic terms, human trafficking is a trade in people for exploitative purposes. Now, the many different purposes vary across regions and countries. However, most cases that are reported are sexual exploitation and forced labor. This is a crime against the individual, including those that are in a migration context, where a victim of organized crime groups will exploit them for money. So in essence, human trafficking is a symptom of something that is unhealthy with our societies. Whereas the smuggling of migrants instead is the payment of a fee to a smuggler who unlawfully transport an individual across an international border. Here I would like to focus on victims and survivors of human trafficking. Of human traffickers and what gaps in protection and their return or integration means. First of all, in essence, one of the key gaps is in early identification of this particularly vulnerable category of individuals. Nassim has mentioned these are people that have already embarked on life-threatening journeys. They have suffered unspeakable harm and trauma, and recognizing the signs of exploitation that they may experience along their journeys or in their countries of destination is essential. So a first gap in protection is the challenge to shift from what I and other colleagues called reception to recognition. In essence, a primary focus of first responders in humanitarian context or in countries of destination of migrants and refugees have been obviously also understandably have been focusing on providing humanitarian aid. So to shelter these people and provide accommodation, food, medical assistance. However, it is necessary to address the vulnerabilities and the needs and risks of being trafficked in the countries of destination and mitigate those risks, irrespective of their status or claims. This obviously has many practical limits and challenges. It has to be said that victims of trafficking in a migration context are extremely vulnerable. They are experience still links with their exploiters. They don't come forward on their own to report abuses because of fear of threatening or psychological and physical fear. Also lack of trust, which is understandable to institutional law enforcement agencies in these countries. And sometimes a lack of knowledge on their rights as well, as Nassim has touched upon that. That is why, and probably we'll come to that, but the proactive responses and investigations to these people are crucial. And responders needs to constantly assess those situations. Why is it important? Well, a failure to protect these particularly vulnerable categories of people obviously undermines the rule of law. It creates, I think, an environment where criminality prevails and prosper. So what originates from a situation of humanitarian assistance crisis ends in a security crisis. In terms of the returns, and I'll turn back to you, and reintegration, international conventions and domestic laws regulate what in essence means return voluntary survivors of human trafficking to their countries of origin. In practice, obviously, it's a difficult process for victims of trafficking. That they, as we mentioned before, they face serious challenges, psychologically, family-related, health, all kinds of legal and financial problems and issues in reintegrating their societies. And these are common in all regions of the world. You mentioned the Mediterranean central route, but this affects really all kinds of victims that embark on a journey back to their countries. Often they do not even have passports or legal identities, and so they need help to be traveled back safely, in safety to their countries. They may feel ashamed to return to their home. Having endured all kinds of exploitation, we're talking about women and girls in particular that are overwhelmingly victims of sexual trafficking. They usually do not share their real experience in their families. They could be alienated from their families for that, and experience some kind of form of retaliation or prosecution by their traffickers. These are not uncommon, especially for those who are trafficked by people involved in other types of criminal activities, like the drug trade or arms trade. They might be placed in centers that are mixed nature, that, for example, also host victims of domestic violence, making their path to reintegration rehabilitation more difficult. You often, for very short amount of times, these shelters might host them for a very limited time that is not necessary the one that is enough to provide for these people. So this is, in a nutshell, whenever you return home a trafficked people, if these problems are not solved and returnees are not supported, you're likely to experience what we call re-victimization. So people are abused again, sometimes even trafficked once more, and this is something that we believe is absolutely to be avoided.
A lot of the points that you've brought up resonate with what happens also in countries of the global south, where that host a majority of the world's displaced populations. And so I wanted to take the conversation to a different part of the world, to Lebanon. And I want to invite Leah Yamin, who's Deputy Director at Lebanon Support, and her work has revolved around social protection, civil society, gender, and visual communication. And Leah, I wanted to focus on the situation in Lebanon because the country is going through such an economic upheaval and amid massive political failures and even culpability. And the issue of refugees and also in some cases domestic migrant workers has been sidelined even more. But in your own work, you look at the needs of all people living in Lebanon, citizens and non-citizens, and you've been looking at civil society initiatives for a while now. Could you explain where your work started, how it's evolved, and more recently in the pandemic period and in the aftermath of the Beirut blast, where are some of the gaps that you've noticed?
Sure, thanks, Preeti, and thank you for organizing this discussion. So as you were saying, I think it's interesting to look at countries of the global south in this context, especially Lebanon, which is a host country, a transition country, and how to say, like an origin country for migration as well. So it has all of these aspects, and we are currently going through a list of multiple crises, financial, currency shortages. There's a pandemic and the health-related crisis. So the list goes on. And in this context, and specifically in Lebanon, the state has not been fulfilling its role in its welfare role, basically. And that has been historically the case, leaving the gap to be filled by civil society actors broadly. Civil society, very broadly, it can be humanitarian, development, anything. So the situation would be for migrants, refugees, and even other vulnerable groups in the country, in the midst of a social protection system that is very fragmented. There's also the fragmentation of civil society interventions and programs. And sometimes it can be difficult to navigate all of that and know who to talk to access which service, which right. And we have been observing the civil society space for a long time. And duplication, lack of coordination, these are all things that have been coming along and appearing since we started work on this. But most recently, I can talk about, as you said, the mobilization of civil society after the Beirut port blast and in the beginning of this year during the lockdown that spanned from January till March, and that was quite strict. So as usual, it was local civil society that really mobilized the most. And we did the survey with respondents themselves to try and identify what were the challenges and what type of gaps they also identified. And it's very interesting because they also note that there are needs on the ground that they cannot fill. And sometimes that's linked to the aid economy itself, with donors and their own agendas and priorities being somewhat imposed. And they have to fulfill their obligations towards their donors, but then it doesn't always match with the most pressing needs on the ground. But also most recently and during this lockdown phase, we asked respondents themselves who they think are the vulnerable groups that were overlooked in the interventions. And 35% of them mentioned refugees. Another 35% of them mentioned migrants. And that also goes back to how civil society works. There's a lot of work in silos, but also focusing on certain sectors and certain populations, which causes even more fragmentation and leaves people to be left behind, basically.
Absolutely, and we'll get back to the solutions part later into the discussion, but we also have a few questions coming in. Nassim, I wanted to get back to you on the also on Lebanon, the Durable Solutions Network, that for which you've been conducting research related to Syrian refugee returns, the push and pull factors. But perhaps while answering that particular question, you could also follow up on an audience question, which is there an international mechanism that obliges nations not to deport asylum seekers until their safety is guaranteed?
Thank you, Preeti, and thank you for the question. So just to start off with the question, perhaps, and I think that's something I would encourage you to read our report was Save the Children, because what we underlined in 2018 is that there is, especially in the case of children, which should be a more simple case to talk about, there is something called the best interest determination of the child. So even if a parent may sign up for a voluntary return and reintegration program to return back to whether it's Afghanistan or Somalia, the best interests of the child have to be taken into account. So there are obligations that European states have to determine whether children's best interests are being are being respected. And that process is oftentimes not respected at all. So if you look at the report, you'll see in most cases of return, there is no such thing as a due process or best interest determination. So that's a very kind of clear legal failing on the part of many European governments. And then in general, what happens is, and I intervene a lot as a country of origin expert for UK and US asylum cases, what happens is you often have court rulings that say that perhaps Afghanistan is not a safe place to return, but Kabul is. And because of the international community investments, because of the security investments, someone may not return, they may not be able to return to his or her province of origin, if it's Herat or Bamiyan, but they can return to Kabul. So there's these assumptions made that someone can just return to any location that they're not from, really disregarding beyond the legal aspects, really disregarding also what we know from the literature, meaning without social networks, without an economic or social capital, you just can't reintegrate. So I think there's enough evidence for us to know that, yes, those rights are not being respected. And very often the response of sending governments is that returnees become, at the point of return, the responsibility of their own governments. So there's very much that delineation between return and reintegration, which in practice, in reality, is a very blurry process. Now, to come back to your question, Preeti, on the durable solutions aspect. So we published another report with the Durable Solutions platform across East Africa, Afghanistan, and Syria 2 years ago on the lessons we've learned of the failures of reintegration in Somalia and Afghanistan to help us at least not repeat the same mistakes in Syria, because there are such things as spontaneous returns, and we all have to prepare to the fact that at some point there might be returns to Syria. So what we can say from our research is, coming back to this question of social networks, for young people who return to places like Syria, we did another piece of research in 2018, or in Afghanistan, that social network simply does not exist. So when we talk about social engagement in communities, psychosocial well-being, youth typically don't have these anchors that can help them feel like they belong. So their identity clashes with the areas that they return to. They usually feel discriminated against due to their language, their ethnic or political affiliation, or their financial and social status. So discrimination in our study of returns to Syria was a main push factor for youth. And social cohesion remains a very sensitive topic to discuss upon return, whether it's in Syria or in Afghanistan. An added layer from that is that there are also very, very often cases of split families and family separation. So I really want everyone here to understand that we're not just talking about individuals being returned. We're talking about children and youth, as I said, but also families who are being separated even after return throughout this migration, non-ending migration process. And so split families, family separation are key protection issues, and temporary returns are key trends in Syria as they are in Afghanistan. And with COVID, with the pandemic, these situations of discrimination, family separation, marginalization are only getting worse. Children are falling out of the school system, and children and youth are entering new migration cycles completely on their own. We see children here in Afghanistan who bear the responsibilities for their families of providing medical care for their mothers by migrating to Iran and sending money back. And we hear similar stories from Syria. So again, these stories of trauma, of protection issues are there. And the last point I would highlight is, in both our studies of returns to Syria and Afghanistan, what we see is after return, internal displacement. So returnees cannot go back often to their places of origin, and they become displaced internally due to conflict, natural disasters, man-made causes. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center has dubbed them the returnee IDPs, a specifically vulnerable group in the Syrian context and in the Afghan context as well. So we really have to analyze the fact that return is not the end of a migration cycle, and that there is no such thing yet as a durable solution in these contexts, but that there's these ongoing cycles of return, internal displacement, cross-border migration, and further migration.
Thank you for that. You've discussed a fair in even greater detail in the Q&A a lot of these aspects of how returnees often get internally displaced. So I would encourage anyone who wants to know more on this topic to visit the Q&A. That's part of the long read, and it's also a standalone piece on the website. We'll post it in the chat box for you. So what you've talked about in terms of sending refugees or
Hi, it's Olivia here. Apologies, it seems that Preethi's camera has frozen. Obviously, she's in Beirut and it's a little bit difficult there with the internet. I wondered whether, I don't know what she was going to say, but I wondered, Leah, if you could pick up and give some thoughts on one of the questions that was asked to us by one of the attendees, just while Preethi kind of regulates and gets a more stable connection. So Dennis Sukowski said, what is your assessment of reintegration programs supporting individuals before and after returning to their country of origin? We may have already covered that. I'm not sure if we have, but if not, Leah, what would your thoughts be on that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
You broke up at some point, yeah.
No worries. So what is your assessment of reintegration programs supporting individuals before and after returning to their country of origin? Oh, Preethi's back. That's great. If you could answer that, and then Preethi can pick up with the question that she was going to ask.
Well, yeah, I guess with the reintegration programs, for me, mainly it would be to, I think like the main concern would be to ensure the protection of people who are being reintegrated. And that's, to me at least, that's what's missing from the conversation and from policies and from policymakers' discourses. There's this notion of like, return and then reintegrate, but don't be our problem in a way. And there's no taking into consideration in any case of the protection of these individuals once they cross the border and get to back home, maybe.
Thank you for picking up on that, Olivia. It's just the nature of being in Beirut. Just had a power cut, and there was a shift between the generator and and that kicked me out of the room. But I'm back, and Claudio, I actually wanted to ask you a follow-up question, and Leah, I'll get back to you on a little bit of what you just mentioned. I was thinking that taking the same Lebanese context into account, where there's so little protection, in general for citizens and non-citizens, Claudio, what would you say the mechanisms are that are
Claudio, do you reckon you want to answer that question to answer?
I guess I guess what she was trying to ask me was what are the solution in this respect, no? What things that have worked in protecting vulnerable migrants, refugees. In that respect, I'd mention three key things. First of all, states need to apply the law. So when the law is applied, that's already a solution. We already have the instruments to protect these individuals. States have a positive obligations to protect these individuals, to offer them solutions to their condition, in particular victims of trafficking in a migration context. For example, the United Nations Protocol Against Trafficking compels states to protect those victims, including among migrants and refugee populations, by giving what they need. At the European level, for example, victims have the right also to seek asylum and be correctly informed about the possibilities of obtaining international protection against the risk of being returned to a country where there is a risk of death, torture, and degrading treatment, and so on. So the first solution is we have the instruments, these needs to be implemented. The second, it goes to a longer term horizon. which is crucial to support in terms of instruments for migrants victims of trafficking that return to their countries or they decide to stay in their countries of destination to rebuild their lives. This has what works. It's when you have an all-encompassing, let's say, offer of assistance that are not just temporary to the rehabilitation of the victim and stop there, but they really look at the mental health care services that these victims need really to process their traumas and to go through the experience they have lived. This entails counseling, financial assistance, legal assistance. In reintegration into the educational system is key. How important is that? Most of the victims of trafficking I have talked to, they don't rank punishing their perpetrators necessarily as the first aspect of hopes that they like to see, although ensuring that we counter the impunity of perpetrators of organized crime that they exploit the perpetrators and the users of their services and goods that are produced by their exploitation is fundamental. But one of the things that they really hope for is to receive education, to be reintegrated, to have perspectives and vocational trainings that are adapted to their hopes and to their need, and that just don't end up there after an initial assistance program. The third aspect I'd like to mention is, and that works in practice, is in ensuring a path to freedom and reintegration, rehabilitation of survivors, both that decide to stay in their countries or their return. A multi-agency inter-cooperative approach across all the responders agencies is fundamental in these countries. This really leverages off the expertise and the tools that not just law enforcement or social workers have, but the healthcare providers. Prosecutors, interpreters is very important for these people. There is always a lack to mediate across social services and victims in the languages. A multi-pronged, multi-agency approach in national countries that put together all the institutions, relevant institutions should provide for these people is fundamental to prevent as well that these people fall behind the cracks of assistance and reintegration measures. Now, in a humanitarian context, the UN interagency mechanism against trafficking has advocated for the need of mainstreaming human trafficking, its indicators, its understanding into the current humanitarian coordination structure and response. This is fundamentally so that the humanitarian actors have also the instruments to recognize and address at the onset of any response they put forward or they program, which needs to be protective, so targeting crisis-affected individuals who are particularly vulnerable in a determined situation, and those that have been trafficked in particular, through a human rights approach and gender-sensitive approach that respects their will and their needs. It needs to be proactive in the sense that, as I mentioned before, this is a very unreported hidden crime. Those migrants and refugees that endure trafficking and exploitations are often do not report voluntarily those crimes. So the responders need to have the instrument to proactively address those and recognize them and refer them to the national institutions. And needs to be fundamentally, this infrastructure needs to be preventive as well. To mitigate any potential risks and factors that can feed the vulnerability of people. Lastly, a point that I'd like to mention, conclude, is the need for better data, enhance really better data collection, because in the case of people that are returned, voluntary or not, there is still not enough data in monitoring and evaluation of what happens 2, 3, 5 years from their return. This is something that is really lacking, and it's fundamental to aspect to be invested to be able to assist this person in the long term.
Thank you for those thoughts, Claudio. Now that we've talked about what needs to be done, Nassim, if you're still with us, yes, you are, great. If you could talk about maybe some of the successful examples you've seen in refugee integration in practice, what does that look like in practice, especially in the Afghan context, and why did it work?
Thanks, Priti. And I think it goes back to Claudio's point is we often don't know enough about what happens after return. And I think part of it is governments don't want to know. So there's a dearth of data, as Claudio just said, which is being addressed now a bit more by different actors. So IOM is doing its fair share. They've issued a new definition of sustainable reintegration that really looks, and that's key to the success, at 3 dimensions: economic, social, and psychosocial. So you can't talk about reintegration if you don't have stability at all these 3 levels. And they've built a reintegration sustainability survey, basically a way to track data from over 50 countries now, I think, that they have in their database. So pretty soon we should be able to talk about comparing data on what works and what doesn't. And clearly one element that works, at least for IOM, in the return of migrants, failed asylum seekers, some of them coming back from traumatic experiences in Libya and elsewhere, is definitely the taking from social work, from the social work disciplines. They've been working with mentors or caseworkers to really provide that individual, tailored, one-on-one conversation and follow through after reintegration. And that we've shown in a study, in an evaluation we did, that really has an impact on reintegration scores. So that psychosocial and social element, now donors and governments are starting to realize how important it is, also how expensive it will be, but it's essential for reintegration. And I would say, just to tell you a bit more of a human story from Afghanistan, and it's true, we don't hear them enough, the success stories, and there are some, but usually it takes, first of all, a lot of time. One of those young men I remember from my field work last year in Bamiyan province, so it's a quite secure province in Afghanistan. That's one of the key requirements, of course. He came back as a refugee from Pakistan, was given several training courses to raise chicken, do poultry farming. Now he has hundreds, if not thousands, of chicken in Bamiyan. He's the main provider of the Afghan army throughout the central provinces. But what's great, beyond the fact that he's clearly succeeding as a businessman, is that what he's doing now is he's hiring other returnees. So he's really taking on that social role of being a mentor himself, of being a model, and of taking others under his wing. And it's only by having these types of collaborations, NGOs really investing in returnees over time, which is what the Aga Khan Foundation did with him in Bamiyan, but also people like him reinvesting in the next generations of returnees. It's essential because it really has to be a collective approach.
Thank you for that. And it's really important to always take it to what does the lived experience look like, because we tend to talk about scenarios. And speaking of a scenario from the state point of view, Leah is an initiative that's trying to actually create synergies between researchers, humanitarian sector, and the policy sphere. What would your main message be in terms of who should be responsible ultimately, whether in the Lebanese situation or in any other country situation, in providing long-term protection and provision of services? What is your ambition or your dream scenario in arriving at social justice for everyone residing in a country?
Before I answer, I'm just going to mention one thing, because both Nassim and Claudio mentioned the importance of better data collection to follow up on reintegration, etc. I think on that note, it's also important to keep in mind that UN agencies and humanitarian agencies and all actors working on this also need better data governance and need to respect digital rights also refugees and asylum seekers, especially in light of the latest data leak of the Rohingya refugees to the Bangladeshi government that then used it for deportations. I think it's essential to mention this. So now I can get back to your question, Preeti. I think Claudio mentioned that states need to apply the law, but mostly states are the main duty bearers. And this is what we go back to usually, because in Lebanon, there's this very fragmented social protection system, and there's a lot of ad hoc interventions and reliance on charities, development, etc. And that is not enough. You need a system that provides protection for all residents. When faced with life shocks, and right now in Lebanon, we're facing multiple life shocks, and this is where it's so apparent that this is a system that is not working, because all of the flaws are magnified right now. People who are considered or used to be considered middle class cannot afford hospitalization care right now. Medicine shortages are everywhere. People cannot find their medication. So really, in this context, we go back to the basics. So the state is supposed to provide and to protect all of its residents, especially in a context like Lebanon, where all of these things are very apparent right now. Because, you know, in lack of this protection, what's going on is that people are seeking to escape. They're traveling for work or trying to, or maybe they're crossing the border at the risk of their own safety and security. And it's creating these new migration trails maybe. But essentially, we need to go back to the roles and responsibilities of the state, and all states also calling here on the countries of the global north to also, you know, look into their own policies and how they, you know, welcome or don't welcome migrants and refugees.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Gru and Hamid, for sitting with us through this hour. And we've looked at these different situations and the possible solutions. But I think what is really important to get back to is what the series tries to highlight is that at a basic individual human level, being part of the host or the refugee or the guest community, there are certain things that need to happen that allow you to restart life. And I wanted to take it back to that level, the individual level, as members of these communities. Gru, from your point of view, what does integration mean and what does recovery mean? And Hamid, I would love for you to share from the person who's entered that community, what does integration mean? Gru, probably you could start.
Yes, I can see that a large problem is the traumas, that they are not given good enough treatment for traumas, neither in our country or in Europe, or not at least those who were deported back to Afghanistan. For them, for those who were deported, they most of them have gone to Iran or Pakistan or trying to go back to Europe. And they have all this luggage on their shoulders. And I have contact with several of them, and I can see they are struggling. So, and some of them has also converted to another religion. And for them, it's the most difficult thing to live in their home country. So that's a big concern for me.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the things that we've discussed a few times, that recovery is not just a linear process. And so anyone from this situation should be given the same kind of services and support that a citizen would be given. And this happens in very, very few cases. And where it does, we can see through the stories that you've told that recovery becomes a much more rapid reality. And so it's actually a very practical investment from the host countries. Hamid, what has integration meant to you, and what does, what did recovery meant to you? If you don't mind my sharing this, when you arrived in Norway, you had to start from scratch, including learning how to read and write. So you're about to start university.
That's right. I arrived Norway, so it was like a whole new life. So I actually intentionally tried to forget my life in Afghanistan and Iran. So I tried to adjust as much as possible in the new country. So if you get your asylum, if you get granted asylum in Norway, there is a very good support system that follow you. And for me to get integrated in the Norwegian society is to be accepted and respected. So if you, as I said, if you have your case granted here in Norway, there is a very good support system. The integration system is very good. And in my case, I got my asylum. I got rejected in the first time, and the second time when I applied, so I granted. And then followed I followed just the system. So there is a very good system, and and there's a very good support system. And also it's it depends on the individual. So and in other cases, I think I'm lucky is because when I arrived in Norway, so I moved from Oslo to Stord, the city I'm living currently. So I'm still living here. There are some people I know, they have been moving around Norway like 20 times. So that's why they haven't progressed in their life in Norway. So when I arrived in Stord, so I started school. So since then I have been going to school. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, what Hamid is referring to is a constant sort of displacement that happens. And even worse is that some of the children or some of the boys who have been rejected by Norway because they can legally move to another part of Europe, they often do. And then they restart the entire application process and have to learn a new language. So it actually sets them back by several years while they're still reeling from trauma. But another point that Hamid made was also that he was among the children who was initially rejected, and as Nassim explained, would be sent back to Kabul and would very likely get internally displaced in a reversal of the decision the court said that he could. And that is the change. That was the pivot. And this is a very individual experience of it that is documented in the long read. And this is also why I wanted you to join, Hamid, is to show the best case scenarios. Thank you for making the time for us. And we have quite a few different comments coming from the panelists, but I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. But I hope that you've had a chance to exchange some of these notes. Dennis is looking for Claudio's response in a few things. So if you could take that up, and we're happy to facilitate the contact information between all of you as needed, as you permit. And I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining from different parts of the world, especially our speakers. And I appreciate this conversation with all of you. And I hope that this is just the start to this project. This is very much a collaborative journalism project. So we invite you to submit articles, analysis from different parts of the world, from different thematic points of view and expertise. Thank you for joining us today.